The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, but early in the morning he arrived again in the temple area, and all the people started coming to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery and made her stand in the middle. They said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" They said this to test him, and so they could have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and began to write on the ground with his finger. But when they continued asking him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let the one among you without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he bent down and wrote on the ground. And in response they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. So he was left alone with the woman before him. Then Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She replied, "No one, sir." Then Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on do not sin anymore." The Gospel of the Lord. Well, have you been busy repenting? You know, it's the 5th Sunday of Lent, guys. Time's coming to a close. Well, I've been repenting. And I've been repenting for a sin that I committed a number of years ago, and one, the guilt from which will haunt me for the rest of my life. And the sin was cowardice. Cowardice. Back in the 90s, when I was pastor of that mega parish up there in Wheeling, I remember the bishop at the time, Bishop Schmidt, called for a new program to be presented to you all, a scriptural-based program. And he wanted the priests to review the program first and to give their opinion on it. So I attended one of the meetings. The meeting was held near the cathedral in Wheeling in one of the buildings there. And so it was to be a day-and-a-half affair. And the meeting opened up at 9 o'clock the first day with Bishop Schmidt leading us in prayer, and then the priest listened to the presenter. And I was sitting at a table towards the left side of the room, and I remember Bishop Schmidt was sitting at a table behind me with a couple of priests. But what got my attention was the table to my right, a couple tables over. There were 3 priests, and one of them was one of our wonderful priests, Father Bob Arkle. Now, Father Bob Arkle was a very quiet man, very humble man, and a very intelligent man. And usually what happens with somebody like that, bishops like to put hats on their heads because they feel they can trust them, they know they'll get the job done, and so on, and they won't say no. Well, Father Bob wore numerous hats. He was over just about every department in the diocese. But what I saw with Father Arkle that day absolutely made me sick. He was sitting at his table, and he was literally bent over almost to this point. And he would bob back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. He looked horrible. His skin was ashen color. And I'm looking at him, and then I begin thinking to myself, why in the world didn't somebody do something? Why didn't somebody say something? You know, the bishop's back there. Why does he go and say, "Bob, come on, we're going to take you to the hospital. We're going to call 911 and get an E-car for you"? Nobody said nothing, including Father Jim Sobis. Well, we managed to make it to 12 noon for our lunch break. The whole time I couldn't keep my eyes off Father Bob. Well, he left, and he didn't return for the afternoon. And we went through the afternoon, and I wondered what was going on. And of course, I was much too busy to go check on Father Bob. And so the next morning, when Bishop Schmidt went to the podium to lead us in prayer, as he was getting ready to start the prayer, He asked that we remember in a special way the repose of the soul of Father Bob Arkle, who they found dead that morning in his apartment. And then the truth came out. You see, Father Bob was a heavy smoker. And I talked to a pulmonologist sometime later, and I said, what was going on? Why was he bent over like that, and why was he bobbing back and forth? He said, Father Jim, that was the only way he could get oxygen into his lungs. He was advanced in terms of emphysema. And then I asked a very difficult question, and I told the doctor I wanted an answer. I said, if I had somehow gotten him to the hospital, could he live longer? And he told me, yes. Because I chose not to act, because I chose to do what everybody else was doing, and that is to say nothing. You know, the emperor has no clothes. Bob Arkle died before his time. Now, he wouldn't have lived for years probably, but the bottom line, he could have survived that episode. And shame on me for not having the courage to stand up and offer him aid. We were all guilty of that sin, but I was guilty of that sin. And that brings us to our gospel today, a passage that should be familiar to all of us. It's been quoted so many times. It appears here in John chapter 8, but thanks to St. Jerome of the 4th century, because we have actually a couple of early manuscripts of Luke's gospel where right after chapter 21, verse 38, this story appears in St. Luke, believe it or not. But Jerome said, no, it belongs here, and that's where it's been ever since. The story opens up, Jesus, we're told, is in the temple precincts area. That's the outer courts of the temple where women and Gentiles were allowed. And there he is teaching when all of a sudden a mob, including scribes and Pharisees, the religious authorities of the day, come bursting into the area, and they wag in front of Jesus, the front of the room, a woman, we're told, who had been caught in adultery. Now, just so you know, in Jewish law, adultery was committed by a married woman or a betrothed woman. Remember, betrothal was the first part of a Jewish marriage process. The woman was wed to her husband for all intents and purposes, but they didn't cohabitate. That didn't happen until the wedding took place. But a woman's brought there who's been caught in adultery, and what happened back then, the woman would be charged with adultery, but if the husband had had an affair with an unmarried woman, then that was excused. That wasn't considered adultery. But it's the penalty for adultery that varied. For instance, in the book of Leviticus, chapter 20, verse 10, the penalty is not specified. What do you do with a woman caught in adultery? In the book of Deuteronomy, however, in chapter 21, verse 20, it said that a woman who was betrothed was to be stoned to death. And what's interesting, remember in Luke's gospel in chapter 1, when the angel comes to Mary to announce the birth of Jesus, she is betrothed. So in other words, Joseph could have had her stoned to death. But in the book of Ezekiel, a little bit later book of the prophets, in chapter 26, beginning at verse 38, we are told that both a betrothed woman and a married woman can be stoned to death. Everybody caught in adultery was stoned. And so now these Pharisees and these scribes approach Jesus, and they ask him a question, we're told, to trap him. And here's the question. Moses said she's supposed to be stoned to death. What do you say? Jesus appears to be in a quandary, a no-win situation. Because if he says, don't stone her to death, then they will accuse him of being an unpious Jew. Because after all, the law said to stone her to death. But on the other hand, if Jesus says stone her to death, then he's in trouble with the Romans. Why? Because in John 18:31, it says very clearly in that passage that the Jews did not have the power anymore to carry out a sentence of capital punishment. You see, the Romans about the year 30, it seems, prevented the Jews from carrying out capital punishment. So the best they could do was to take this woman to the Romans and hope that they would put her to death. And there's no guarantee they would. But the problem is, no matter how he answers, he's going to get in trouble. But notice what he does. He gets down and he traces with his finger on the ground. And people have speculated for centuries, what in the world is he writing? We don't know. St. Jerome said he was writing the sins of the scribes and Pharisees who accused this woman. I find that a rather novel sort of suggestion. Personally, I think he's simply letting off steam. Why? Because Jesus is looking at them, and I know in his mind he's thinking, you hypocrites. And so he straightens up, he looks them in the eye, and he says that famous line, let those among you who have no sin go ahead and cast the first stone. And as we know, they all lower their heads, beginning with the elders, and turn around and walk away, dropping their stones in the process, because there ain't a one of them sinless. That leaves Jesus alone with the woman. He looks at her and says, where is everybody? Where'd they go? No one to condemn you? And she says, no one, sir. And then Jesus simply looks at her with love and says, neither do I condemn you. Go, but sin no more. End of story. So what's the point of this story? What's Jesus saying to us through this powerful story? Well, first of all, back in the 60s, and it was kind of funny, there was a liberal movement in biblical studies, and there was a liberal everything in everything back in the 60s. And that was to say, well, if they, the scribes and Pharisees, who were the judges of the day, didn't have the sinlessness in order to condemn somebody else, then our judges and magistrates today have no right to issue a sentence against a criminal. Well, we need those judges and magistrates, and there's not a one of them probably that's sinless. But the bottom line is they have a duty to perform for our society. But there's something else going on, something that you have to go back once again to the Old Testament to appreciate. There was a man named Phineas, says the book of Numbers, chapter 25, verses 6 through 18, and the first book of Maccabees, chapter 2, verse 26. Who was Phineas? He was a religious zealot. And here's what happened according to the book of Numbers. Phineas walked in on a Jew who was having an affair with a pagan woman. He caught him in the act of intercourse. And he took his sword in the name of the Lord and slaughtered them both. It's known in the biblical world as the zeal of Phineas. It was a fanaticism, if you will. We see it today among the Islamic extremists in the Holy Land, even to today. People who become zealous, and they lose their sense of common sense and judgment in order to carry out the will of the Lord, if you will. And that's what Jesus is dealing with. These scribes and Pharisees have something of a religious mob mentality going on. But you see, Jesus stands for the truth and only the truth. And he will not allow them to get by with an act of lawlessness, or he will not allow them to get by without questioning their motives. Why are they doing what they're doing? Furthermore, what about the spiritual state of the woman? Did anybody ask the question if she was sorry for what she had done? Was she truly penitent? And did that count for anything? It should have. And then what about the fact that the woman, if she was like most women back then, could neither read nor write? So how was she supposed to know the law? How was she supposed to know the consequences of her behavior? Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. Did she know the commandment number 8 and all the other commandments, number 6 with regard to adultery, and so on and so on? If she couldn't read or write, and men were the ones who received the education, did she know? But even more so, you have to wonder a little bit about the behavior of the husband. What's his real motivation behind having witnesses stage to watch his wife in an act of adultery? Was there something else going on behind the scenes that we don't know about, that only the Lord would have known? Did she not scramble his eggs properly or put enough pepper in his meat? And so this guy wants to get rid of her, and the best way to do it is by having her stoned to death? But even more so, beyond the letter of the law, what about the spirit of the law? These people would have known the prophet Hosea, and Hosea would have said in this situation, what is the husband doing to forgive her and win her heart back to him? Did they take any of these things into consideration? You know, the Lord, when he makes that statement, let those who are without sin cast the first stone, had in the back of his mind the following, and this comes from Exodus chapter 23. You shall not repeat a false report, aka gossip. Do not join the wicked in putting your hand as an unjust witness upon anyone. Neither shall you allege the example of the many as an excuse for doing wrong, nor shall you, when testifying in a lawsuit, side with the many in permitting justice. Or in other words, you can't use the excuse, well, everybody else is doing it, so I did it too. See, Jesus had all that in mind. He knew how powerful and dangerous gossip could be, how people love to rip others apart behind their backs, and that could have a major bearing on what was going on in this case. And so he simply turned the tables on them. My brothers and sisters, the meaning of this passage, Jesus witnessed to the truth. There were plenty of cowards in the room who cared less about the truth. But Jesus was not going to let them get by without listening to the truth. And so they all walked away. The question is, what about us? Do you defend the truth? Are you willing to sacrifice friendships and whatever the case may be in order to witness for the truth when someone is unjustly accused? You know, there's a situation that unfolded since August up north that has absolutely rocked the northern panhandle of West Virginia and the section of eastern Ohio where Steubenville is located. You don't hear anything about it hardly down here at all, but it's been a horrible thing. And what happened was this. One August night, a 16-year-old female student at Weird Madonna High School crossed the bridge into Steubenville, Ohio, right across the river, telling her parents she was going to stay with a friend. She had alcohol, a bottle of vodka in possession, and she attended not one but two parties and got herself stoned drunk. And while that was going on, a 17-year-old boy and a 16-year-old boy from Steubenville High School, both a part of the football team, raped her multiple times. They took pictures of her naked body and put it on the internet. And that's not the worst of it. The worst of it, it was revealed in court yesterday, her so-called friends abandoned her and went to their own homes. They left her with these savages. At 10 o'clock this morning, the judge issued a guilty sentence against the two boys. I haven't heard what their punishment's going to be yet. But bottom line, what a horrible crime. How could kids walk away from their friend and allow their friend to be raped continuously? What kind of friends are they? Perhaps the better question would be, what's happening to our youth? That they're so numb to the hurt and the suffering of other people. You know, they've watched so many video games and so many hours of goofy reality television that they've distanced themselves emotionally from the real world. That's what's going on behind the scenes. But there's other situations that happen in this life too, my brothers and sisters. And I'd like to share a story with you that I've recalled from a number of years ago and I dug up this week. Most of you probably, when you were taking philosophy in college, and I'm presuming that everybody had philosophy they were taking college, studied a modern philosopher by the name of Albert Camus. He was an atheist existentialist philosopher from France. In his famous novel, The Fall, Camus tells of a man tortured by guilt. Years have passed, but his memory haunts him. He is moved from one place to the next, but his guilt follows him. His terrible memories go back to a night in Paris when he was walking along the Seine River. He noticed a young woman dressed in black and standing on a bridge. He hesitated for a moment, then he walked on. Then he heard a splash, and then screams and cries for help, and then silence. He convinced himself that he could not help, so he walked on. Years later, finally confessing his guilt to a stranger in a bar in Amsterdam, he concluded by saying, "Oh, young woman, throw yourself into the water again so that I may see a second time and have the chance of saving both of us." Saving both of us. You see, my brothers and sisters, when we turn our head from the truth, when we refuse to witness to the truth for comfort or convenience, we are scarred for life. You can deny it all you want to and say, "Oh, that's somebody else's problem." No, Camus had it right. It's your problem too. We all have those times in the past, perhaps, when we acted like cowards, as I did. But my brothers and sisters, that's not what the Lord stood for. This passage is a powerful example to us of his courage in witnessing to what's true and it's right and not compromising what he believed in. Let us pray for the grace to repent of our cowardice, our sinfulness, and follow the example of the one who witnessed to the truth, Jesus Christ.